So today we'll be talking about CloverDX 6.6, which we released about 2 weeks ago, or just over a week ago now. Uh, and as usually, I'll cover the highlights of the release. If you'd like to learn more about that, either contact us or have a look at our release notes or the documentation. We are still keeping the same release cadence as always. So one release per quarter. At the end of the quarter, we release, and we intend to keep that going forward. So there will be at least one bug fix release for 6.6 within about a month or so. And then just before the holidays, we plan to release CloverDX 7.0. So there will be a little bit bigger release compared to the others. As far as the highlights of the 6.6 release, there's again quite a lot of stuff that we've updated. The first thing that I'll talk about is more flexibility in data apps. This is something that we see people use quite often. We have new structure of the documentation. Then I'll show you. The goal was to make it easier to use for especially new users. We've introduced some features around the security, like for example, temporary file encryption, or the ability to have dynamic secure parameters. We've added a new Wrangler step called fill down, which I'll show you how it works. And we've made many changes in the data manager. For example, we introduced the batching, lookups, and more, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And as always, there are some changes within the platform itself to allow us to support, for example, newer Java versions, security fixes, and various updates around that. As always, we have full release notes published on our website where you'll be able to read a little bit more about the highlighted features or have a look at the full list of changes that have been implemented in this release. So let's start with data apps first. We've made several improvements in data apps. They are all relatively small on their own, but together they allow you to implement data apps that are a little bit more complex than what you can do, what you've been able to do before without quite a bit of JavaScript included in the apps. So what you can do now is build essentially data apps that contain multiple pages, kind of like a wizard, where you have a first page with some parameters. And instead of running the app and producing the output directly, you can redirect to a second page of the data app, which allows you to do additional parameters and so on, all the way to however many steps you want to have, and finally to actually run whatever you need to run as part of the application and produce the output. Since the decision of where to redirect is within the data app, you can even branch inside data apps if you want to. And for example, based on user's choice, you can pick a different application that produces different kinds of data or performs completely different tasks. We've made a number of smaller improvements in how the data apps are displayed. In the end, it will now work a little bit better with high resolution screens, so the output will take more of the viewport rather than being just centered as a small part of your whole screen in the middle. We, for example, use SVG element instead of the base 64 encoded image data for displaying SVG content, which will allow you to integrate better with like additional functionality or advanced functionality within SVG files where you can have JavaScript included and so on. So that will now work naturally without you having to build an HTML element around that. And one more thing for the data apps, you can now decide whether the data app is shown in the catalog or not. That is something that allows you to just hide the app, but it's still accessible. And that's meant to be used for the applications that are typically in the middle of the kind of like wizard pages, right? Because you want your users to start on page 1, not somehow be able to start on page 3 and then wonder why it doesn't work when they are missing some parameters that are filled in the first steps. So a few small improvements, but together they help you build applications that are a bit more flexible and more powerful. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've introduced a new Wrangler step called fill down. This is a step that helps you work with data that contains merged cells in an Excel file. I'll show you what it looks like, but essentially, typically, you will see that in reports or various files that are modified by hand, where people create files that have lots of colors and so on, and a lot of merged columns. And when you read that kind of a file in Clover, you'll get empty data where the merged columns are or merged cells are. Like for example, this is typically a merged cell with three cells in the original Excel file. And this is not what you want, right? You want to have the USA written in here for like each product category. And this is exactly what the fill down step does. It looks at the data as it's ordered in here and fills down the values so that you don't have nulls there anymore. So it allows you to process a little bit more complex Excel files easily without having to write your own data source for them. Another large change, but not in the code of the product itself, but rather in the services that we provide around it, is the updated documentation. We have completely redesigned the structure of the documentation. I'll walk you through the changes a little bit later on the demo part. But the goal was to essentially help different kinds of users find the information they are looking for. The old documentation, you can see the structure in here, was structured around essentially parts of the product. But for example, designer covers so many different things, right? Some parts of the designer, or at least the designer documentation, were about components or CTL, but some were about some parts of the server and so on. So it was quite confusing if you were a new user. We've switched to a structure that's centered around users and what they want to do. So we have a separate section about administration, which will be frequented by people who need to uh, install or manage environments. The development is for the data engineers who need to know about components, CTL, how to build data services, and all of that. Automation is about the server, and end users guide is for the users of Wrangler and the data manager. So it's essentially a guide for non-technical users of the platform, so they'll be able to learn how to use those parts of the product because they are unlikely to work within the administration or the development parts. So with that said, I'm sure that this will be a little bit confusing for users who are used to the old style of the documentation or old structure of the documentation, but you'll get used to it relatively quickly. It's much easier to find things if you don't know where they are. And obviously, search still works, so you'll be able to search for stuff if you don't know where it is in the new structure. As always, we've implemented a number of security features besides the usual like security fixes where we updated a number of libraries to uh, to to resolve various vulnerabilities that have been discovered in those libraries. We have two new features that allow you to work better with your data and hide or prevent data leaks. The first one is the ability to encrypt temporary files that are created as part of job execution. So every time when a job runs, Clover creates various temporary files. These are created especially, for example, if you work with large data sets, right? So for example, if you try to sort 1 billion records, it probably is not going to fit into memory. So Clover will create a set of temporary files and work with those and essentially sort within those files. And what you can do now is to enable encryption of those files. So even if someone manages to get a copy of those files, they will not be able to read them because the encryption key is tied to the execution environment, the sandbox. So copying those files into a different server will not help. And so it's not a key that's shared across all instances of Clover, but rather a new key is created every time so that the file content cannot be revealed by copying it somewhere else unless you really know the key. And the second part, and especially this is something that will help you when you need to get some sort of certification or where you have tighter security standards for what data does when it's not being processed. And the second part, the second feature that we implemented is dynamic secure parameters. This is essentially a combination of two features that we had before. You were able to create dynamic parameters that change their values as the graph executes, or when the graph starts, a new value is computed, but the parameter stays constant afterwards. And then you've been able to create secure parameters that hide the value of the parameter. These were typically used for all kinds of secrets like passwords, URLs, usernames, security keys, or application tokens and similar. And you have not been able to combine these very well. It kind of worked, but it wasn't very well supported. So now it's fully supported, so you can edit dynamic and secure parameters in the designer. So it will show you the proper code editor and everything. And the value of the parameter will be computed dynamically when the graph starts. So you can use any code. Typically, this is used for configuration, decision, and so on. and the value will then be hidden whenever it's used. And so you'll see stars when the value is displayed, for example, in the server. In the logs, it will be hidden and masked with stars and so on. So this will help you protect these kinds of secrets, especially when you work with logs. So it will make it easier for you, for example, to share logs with our support, because you no longer have to worry about sharing some sort of secret value if you mark it as a secret parameter, even if it's a dynamic parameter. Then as for platform updates, we've made quite a few changes, essentially preparing for even bigger changes in CloverDX 7. So right now we are working on adding support for Java 17 to CloverDX. So we've done that for Apache Tomcat stack in CloverDX 6.2. So that's been a while ago. So Tomcat supports both JDK 17 and JDK 11. In this release, in 6.6, we've added support for JDK 17 to JBoss web server stack. And it's a replacement. So you can't run Clover on JBoss anymore with Java 11. You have to use Java 17. The only stack that doesn't support Java 17 for now is VMware TC Server stack. And that's because we will be removing that stack in the release 7. So when we look at what's going to happen in the next release, there will be a little bit bigger jump where we'll upgrade Tomcat to 10.1. That will require to install a new application server, and the configuration works slightly differently. We will stop supporting Java 11 altogether. Right? It's no longer possible to run Java 11 in Tomcat 10.1 with the Spring version that we'll have to upgrade to as well. And the Red Hat JBoss web server stack will be upgraded to version 6 as well. So we will have two stacks, right? Tomcat and JBoss. Both of them will support Java 17, and you will no longer be able to use Java 11. So if you are on Java 11 still, you will have to migrate away once you switch to CloverDX 7, and you'll also have to upgrade your application server. We'll of course provide support to any customer who needs any help with that or any advice, or even if you have some code that relies on running on Java 11, we'll try to help you if we can. All right, seems that my slide has somehow gone dark. So let's talk about Data Manager. This is one of the largest features we've introduced in a while. We've actually introduced it in CloverDX 6.5 as an incubation feature. And the goal of the Data Manager is to provide users with a user interface that allows them to review, edit, and approve data. So essentially, as you're processing data in Clover, instead of just kind of letting the data flow through the platform from the input through transformation and to the output, you'll be able to send it to Data Manager, where the data can be displayed in a UI like this, and you can edit the records. Right? And the goal is to essentially help you with data quality, because typically what we see people need to do is to have some sort of a good way to fix the records that have been flagged as incorrect. So they often come up with all kinds of solutions that unload the data outside of the platform, where data gets fixed and then it's reloaded back. Now you don't have to do that anymore. You can use Data Manager for that. It works well within larger teams. There's security baked into it because you can have different people having different permissions. Everything is audited, so all the changes that you made to your data, you can see their history and so on. So this is something that we've introduced in 6.5 as an incubation feature. It's still an incubation feature in 6.6, and it will stop being an incubation feature in CloverDX 7.0. The reason why we keep it as an incubation is because we are still making substantial changes, so it's not entirely compatible between 6.5 and 6.6. You still need to do some work, and there's potential for those kinds of breaking changes between CloverDX 7 and 6.6 as well. So let's talk about what we've added in this release. There are two large features. The first one is the batching in data sets. This is essentially something that allows you to look at your data slightly differently. In 6.5, you are able to load any volume of data into the Data Manager and essentially have it as one large data set where all the records are together in one table, kind of, and you can see all of them. But this is not something that works in every circumstance. In many cases, you need to batch the data or group it based on something. Oftentimes, it's based on, for example, the file where the data arrived in, or based on originating country or region or a month, right? Depending on what kind of data you have. And this is exactly what the batching allows you to do. You can pick any column from your data set as a batching key, whether it's a string or integer or a date, and it will split your data set into batches. For example, on the screenshot in here, you can see a customer data set which contains a list of customers uh, batched based on the state where the customer is from. And this is advantageous in many ways because oftentimes the batches need to be kept together. So you either process the whole batch or you don't. You can't process half of it because it doesn't make sense. And in many cases, the batches represent slight changes in business process. Right? For example, if it represents different countries for invoices, the processes in different countries for how the invoices work or what they need to contain can be different because of different laws and so on. Right? So all kinds of things can change slightly, but still the overall business process that you want to use is the same. So that's when you use the batching. The batching is computed real time, so it doesn't change your data. It's just the view of how you look at it. So you can change the batching at any time without uh, causing any changes that would require audit trail or anything like that. So it's something that helps you work with data. But if you get into a situation where you don't want to do that, you can easily switch it off in the data manager. The second feature that we introduced is what we call lookups. This is an extension of a lists feature from the previous release where you can have a lookup that's more complex than the list. List was just that, right? A simple list of items where you can say that certain column can only have values from a given list. Now it can be more complex because with the lookup, you can get additional context, right? So you still have the list, which is the first column of the lookup in here, but you can have additional context that provides you more information about the item you are about to select. In many use cases, when you need to validate the data and pick the correct value from a list, you actually need more information than just the name of the entry in the list to be able to decide which one it is. So this is what you can now do with lookups. The lookups are managed by the server, so they are common to all data sets. You can use the same lookups in all of them, and they are shared by all users of the system. Uh, as always, we've made a lot of smaller changes. Uh, we've introduced several ways of filtering and searching your data, so it's now much easier to find records that are invalid and work with just those. You can filter based on audit trail. So, for example, you can find changes made by specific user in your data set or at specific time. You can also work better with the records themselves because you can go back and forth within their kind of like state space, whether they are new, edited, or approved. So all kinds of smaller changes that help you work with your data more effectively. And especially if your data sets are larger, the search and filtering will help you narrow down uh, whatever you are trying to do to just the records that you need so that you are not bothered by all the others and can work and focus on just specific type of issue as needed. One of the other things that we've introduced is the ability to uh, evolve your data sets in Data Manager. Since your data evolves as well, right? You might decide that your business process needs an extra column or something changes. Maybe some column was removed or renamed or moved around in the data. All of that you can now do within Data Manager. You can even do it when there is data in the data set, so you don't have to have an empty data set to be able to change the layout. So this allows you to essentially evolve your data set as your processes around it evolve. And there's, of course, a lot more usability, performance improvements, and so on. This is essentially in preparation for releasing the full version of the data manager in CloverDX 7 in roughly 3 months. So that was everything from me as far as the theory goes. Let's now have a look at the demo. So the first thing that I'll show you will be the documentation. So let's go to our online version of the documentation. The same is packaged with the designer, and you can see the new structure. Let me zoom in a little bit. Right, so I'll just kind of walk you through that. So as I mentioned before, the administration section is for the people who manage instances of CloverDX, whether they need to install it or perform upgrades or need to figure out how to configure something. This is where you look. And before, this was split among 3 different parts of the documentation, so it was much harder to find. The same goes for the development, where all tasks related to building something within Clover, whether you need to build a graph or a job flow or something else, all of that can be found here. It starts with first steps of the designer, walk you through how to use the designer, project types, all the way to component references, CTL reference, or even advanced topics that help you build libraries or shared lookup tables, which is the functionality that supports the lookups in the data manager. The automation and operations is about working with the server and how to configure it to run your jobs in like automated fashion. So you can see how the scheduling works, for example, data services, data types, and so on. You can learn here about different APIs of the server or how to use the libraries and how the sandboxes work. And finally, we have the end users guide section, which contains the Wrangler user guide that we've had before. The structure of the Wrangler guide didn't change substantially underneath. And we have a completely new documentation for the data manager so that you can learn how that part of the product works as well. As I mentioned before, the search works. So you can find, for example, a component or anything else, just as you were able to find it before. And so, and the articles themselves use the same structure, but we've improved the text in many cases. We'll be continuing with documentation updates, so there's more good stuff waiting for you here in the future with regards to what the documentation will look like. Right. The second thing that I wanted to talk about was the Wrangler step. So let's open the Wrangler. And actually, let's have a look at the source document first. Find it in here. So this is the document that we are working with. And as I mentioned, the feature is designed mainly to help processing files that have been typically prettified so that you have this as a single cell in Excel. And when you work with this kind of data, you are going to read it as 3 rows, right? Because there are really 3 rows. But in the first column, the third and fourth row of the data, or sorry, the second and third row of the data will be empty. And we can have a look at that in Wrangler. This is the job that reads the file that I've just shown you. And let's have a look at what we get out of the file. And when we read raw data, zoom in a bit, we get the no value in here, right? Because it's an empty cell, and fill down steps helps me fill that in so that I can actually know the country or any kind of category. This can be applied to any type of column, whether it's a string, date, integer, or anything else. So you'll be able to use that. It relies on the data order originally. So if I decided to sort the data, it would of course break that. So I first need to fill down my data and then afterwards sort by country if I need to, or by something else. For example, I wanted to sort by product category. So fairly simple step as far as the concept goes, but very useful in processing common Excel files that often contain merged cells. All right, and finally, let's have a look at the data manager. I'll walk you quickly through the batching and through the lookups. So let's go here as well. And as I mentioned, we've made a lot of small changes that help you use data manager easily. So it's much easier to just work with it if you get a little bit of experience with that. So first, let's have a look at this data set called vegetable harvest. And I'll talk about batching first. So this one doesn't have any batching, which you can see in here. It contains about 700 records, or actually almost 800. So let's have a look at the data. When I click on the data set, I'll be taken right away to my data, and I can see what it is, right? I can edit the values if I need to search and so on. But as I mentioned, in many cases, this is not exactly what you want, right? You might want to separate the data into smaller groups based on something, based on, for example, vegetable type or something else. But in here, the best way to do that is actually based on the origin, because oftentimes, like produce from different countries will have different prices or different policies for how it needs to be handled, and so on. So let's do that. And to enable batching, you can simply go. You can either do that when you create a data set, but as I mentioned, we implemented the data set evolution, so you can change pretty much every property of the data set as you go along. So let's do the batching here based on the origin, and that's it. Right now it says that I have 5 batches because my data comes from 5 countries. You can see that I have only a subset of records in each, and looking at them, I'll get just records, for example, in here from Canada. So this helps me work with data because oftentimes, especially if you partition or batch based on a region or something similar, you'll have regional domain experts who will know that part of the world or what's different from the others, and they will know how to handle it properly. So that's batching, a very simple concept. It doesn't change anything in the data, so there's no entity called badge or anything like that. It doesn't change your values, which is why it doesn't appear in the audit, and you can change it if you need to, for example, because you've decided to process the data that you have there in slightly different way. The second feature that I wanted to talk about is the lookup. So I'll disable the batching so that I can get all the rows into same place. Let's go back in here. So the data manager allows you to edit your data so that you can fix all kinds of data issues. And typically when you load data into data manager, you'll have the backend figure out the issues and mark them for you in some way. The ones that the cells that have the red triangle are the ones that have errors, and the error message is something that I populated in a graph that feeds data into the data manager. And in this case, it says that this is an unknown lattice variety because this is just a limited set of values, right? This column is configured to only allow a specific set of varieties. You can't type in here just a random thing. And this is what the lookups do. They allow you to restrict the possible set of values for a certain column. And you can see all of the values in here. There is no limit on the size of this lookup, and we actually even have a customer who is planning to have more than 150,000 items in the lookup in here with about 8 columns of context. So you can go pretty big with this if you need to. And the best part of this is that the lookups allow you to do the same kind of suggestions that we've been able to do with lists before. So the backend, the job that validates your data, can make suggestions to what is the best value. And it's up to you to pick the correct one based on whatever context you have, right? So for example, the window in here is built so that you can scroll up and down and look at values of other columns that might not be visible in the default view, right? So for example, I need to figure out which of the 3 items it is, and the code says that the first one is the most likely, but it might not be true, right? I need to look at the vegetable type, the field, and the band, and let's see what I have here, right? So I have the field A, which is fine, that's fine, and the premium, that's okay, and it's a lettuce. So in this case, it's probably going to be the first one. So I just pick that and fix the value. And this way, when you go through your items, you can select the ones that are the correct based on all the information that you have in here. Of course, we have the search in here because, as I mentioned, the lists can be quite long in many use cases. So you'll be able to find, for example, if I wanted everything that has a garden name, I can find it like this. And I also mentioned that we've made a lot of improvements to filtering and so on, so I can easily filter just the rows that have some sort of an issue with them. I can even filter based on specific column, and if I have issues in, or if I want to work with data that has issues in specific column, I can select columns in here. I don't think I'll have anything there, so it will be empty. but still you are able to do this kind of thing. Of course, if you configure more complex filters, you can clear them easily. An interesting feature is filtering based on the audit, where you can, for example, filter based on the date when the change has been made or who made the change. So everyone who is in here has been able to make changes before, and you can filter based on that, or based on the columns that have been changed. You can freely combine filters, so you can easily find rows that have errors in a specific column and have been changed recently by a certain user. And on top of that, you can even search based on values in here. Expand the filter. And then this allows you to configure different kinds of filter depending on what is the type of the column, whether you want to search by equality or substrings or strings and so on. So all kinds of options to help you narrow down the data you want to work with. And if you overdo it with filters, you can easily clear all of them. Another feature that we've added is the ability to change the status of your rows more freely. So you can now go back, right? For example, now I marked this as edited and approved, but you can undo that if you need to, for example, to reject a row and send it back to the original editor. All of that is, of course, audited. So if I look at the audit trail, I can see all the status changes, or even in here where I changed the value, I will be able to see the value changed in my audit record.